The Kaelith Concord had made first contact with 143 species across 11,000 years, and every single one of them followed the same pattern. First, fear. Then, negotiation. Then, quiet, orderly submission into the Concord's trade network, where a species would spend the next few centuries being useful, compliant, and grateful for the privilege of being allowed to exist alongside a civilization so much older than their own. Humanity was supposed to be number 144. The Kaelith ship entered Earth's solar system on a Tuesday, though of course, the Kaelith didn't call it that. They called it the 412th cycle day of their observation period, the final entry in a surveillance campaign that had lasted almost 60 Earth years. Quiet drones in high orbit. Passive scans. No contact, no interference, just watching, the way you'd watch an anthill before deciding whether to step on it or study it. Ambassador Threlvash had read every report twice. Humanity was violent. Humanity was fractured into competing factions that couldn't agree on borders, currencies, or the correct temperature to serve their beverages. Humanity had built weapons capable of ending their own species roughly 40 times over and, astonishingly, hadn't done it yet. By every Concord metric, they were primitive, unstable, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to them. Threll found that reassuring. Unstable species negotiated fast. They panicked. They signed whatever terms guaranteed protection from a threat they didn't understand. It was, by his estimation, going to be the easiest first contact of his 300-year career. He was wrong about almost everything, and it started going wrong within the first 11 minutes. The Kaelith vessel, a slate gray crescent nearly 2 kilometers long, dropped out of high orbit and settled itself directly above the Atlantic Ocean, broadcasting a simple, universal greeting on every frequency humanity used for communication. Radio. Television. Satellite uplinks. Even, out of what Threll considered a courteous touch, a handful of amateur ham radio bands, because his cultural briefing suggested humans value gestures of inclusivity. Within 4 minutes, every major government on Earth had scrambled a response team. Within 7 minutes, 3 of those governments had also, independently and without informing each other, scrambled fighter jets. Within 11 minutes, a single human aircraft, unarmed, unremarkable, flying nowhere near any military installation, banked hard and flew directly toward the Kaelith ship at a speed that made absolutely no strategic sense. Threll's tactical officer, a sharp-eyed Kaelith named Ositran, pulled up the aircraft's identification. It wasn't military. It wasn't government. It was registered to a 61-year-old civilian named Robert Callahan, a retired commercial pilot flying what his flight plan described, with almost insulting simplicity, as a sightseeing tour. He's flying toward an object 2 kilometers long that just appeared out of nowhere, Ossa said slowly, with a single-engine aircraft with no weapons, no shielding, and no authorization. Order him to turn back, Threll said. They did. Robert Callahan did not turn back. He got close enough for his cockpit camera, which, it would later turn out, he'd been live-streaming the entire time to approximately 400,000 people, to capture the first clear video footage of the Kaelith vessel in human history. Then he circled it once, waved out the window at a ship that could not possibly see him waving, and flew home. That should have told Threll something. It didn't, not yet. He filed it under isolated anomaly and proceeded with the plan. The formal contact meeting took place 6 days later, in a converted conference facility outside a city the humans call Geneva, chosen, according to the briefing, for its long history of neutral diplomacy. Threll arrived with a delegation of 4. The humans arrived with a delegation of 19, representing not one government but a coalition of competing nations who had, in the space of 6 days, done something Threll's threat models had assigned an 11% probability of happening within 6 years. They had agreed on something. Not everything. Threll would learn quickly that humans agreeing on everything simply didn't happen. But on this, on the fact that first contact with an alien civilization needed a unified human response, they had found consensus with a speed that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. At the head of the human delegation sat a woman named Dr. Naomi Reyes, a linguist by training, though Threll's briefing noted with visible confusion that she had somehow also been granted authority to negotiate matters of planetary defense, trade, and sovereignty, none of which fell remotely within her professional field. "You're not a diplomat," Threll said, through the translation interface, as an opening test. He wanted to see how she'd react to being challenged. "No, Dr. Reyes said. I'm the person who figured out your language fastest. Everyone else is still catching up. So for today, I talk, and they listen. She gestured, without turning, at the 18 people behind her, several of whom were generals, several of whom were heads of state, all of whom deferred to her without visible resentment. Thrall filed that away too. A species that could set aside ego and hierarchy that quickly, when it mattered, was not behaving like the fractured, unstable civilization his reports described. The negotiation itself began exactly as Thrall expected. The Concord's terms were generous. By their own measure, humanity would be granted provisional membership, access to a fraction of Concord trade routes, medical technology sufficient to eliminate most disease, and protection from the 17 known hostile species operating within 400 light-years of Earth. In exchange, humanity would submit to Concord oversight of its weapons development, permit monitoring stations in orbit, and agree to a 200-year probationary period before full membership rights were extended. It was, Thrall believed, an offer no rational species would refuse. Dr. Reyes read the terms twice. Then she asked a question that Thrall's entire negotiation training had not prepared him for. What happens to the humans who say no? I don't understand the question, Thrall said. This is a species-wide agreement. Individual dissent is irrelevant too. It's not irrelevant to us, she said. So I'll ask again. If we sign this, and there are people, a lot of people, probably, who don't want their governments giving up weapons oversight to an alien fleet they've known about for 6 days, what happens to them? Thrall consulted his delegation briefly. They would be managed through your own domestic institutions. That is not the Concord's concern. It's absolutely the Concord's concern, Reyes said, because you're asking us to sign something that assumes we're one thing. A government. A hive. A single decision maker. We're not. We're 8 billion people who agree on almost nothing, and the only reason 19 of us are sitting in this room together is that we scared each other into cooperating for exactly as long as it takes to figure out if you're a threat. She let that sit in the silence for a moment. So before we talk about terms, she continued, I need you to understand what you're actually negotiating with. You're not negotiating with the government. You're negotiating with a species that fights itself constantly, that has never in its recorded history all agreed on anything for more than a few years at a time, and that has, despite that, or maybe because of that, never lost a war it decided it couldn't afford to lose. Thrall's translator flagged the phrase as a possible idiom, a boast, or a warning. His own instincts, honed over 3 centuries, told him it wasn't any of those. It was a fact, stated plainly, by someone who expected him to understand its weight and suspected he didn't. He didn't. Not yet. The negotiations stretched across 4 months, and with every week, the picture the Concord had built of humanity over 60 years of quiet observation began to come apart at the seams. Thrall's reports had described a species with modest industrial capacity, incapable of rapid mobilization, dependent on fragile supply chains that would collapse under any real pressure. What he watched happen instead was that within 3 weeks of first contact becoming public knowledge, 41 separate nations had redirected portions of their industrial output toward a single, unified goal, understanding and, if necessary, matching whatever technology the Kaelith possessed. They didn't have Concord-level physics. Thrall knew that, and it was true. But what they had, that no Concord threat assessment had ever properly weighted, was speed. A Concord research initiative of similar scope would take a species like Thrall's own homeworld roughly 40 years to organize, fund, and produce meaningful results, slowed by bureaucracy, consensus building, and generational caution baked into a species that measured its own lifespans in centuries. Humans did it in 4 months. Not because they were smarter, Thrall came to realize, but because they were desperate and impatient and had spent their entire recorded history solving problems under exactly that kind of pressure. Wars. Plagues. Famines. Climate collapse they'd narrowly, chaotically managed to slow just decades earlier. Every crisis they'd survived had trained them, generation after generation, to treat existential threats not as a reason to freeze, but as a deadline. The Concorde had never negotiated with a species that treated an alien fleet parked in low orbit as, functionally, a deadline. By month 2, human physicists, working from nothing but the 6 days of scant data Robert Callahan's joyride had inadvertently provided, plus whatever fragments leaked from the ongoing negotiations, had produced a working theoretical model of Kaelith shield technology that was, according to Thrall's own engineers, unsettlingly close to correct. By month 3, 3 separate human space agencies, competing against each other as fiercely as they were nominally cooperating, had each independently proposed orbital defense platforms that Thrall's military advisor, a blunt, taciturn officer named Kes Dorvan, described in a private briefing as not currently something we could ignore, if it came to that. It won't come to that, Thrall said. I agree, Kes said. But I want it on record that 4 months ago I would have said the species couldn't threaten a Concord patrol vessel if they had 100 years. Now I'd give them one bad decade. By month 4, the terms of the agreement had changed so dramatically from the Concord's original offer that Thrall found himself, for the first time in his career, negotiating not from a position of overwhelming advantage, but from something closer to parity. The 200-year probationary period had been negotiated down to 20. The weapons oversight clause had been rewritten so many times it barely resembled the original, ending not in Concord control, but in a joint monitoring framework that gave humanity nearly as much visibility into Concord military movements near Earth as the Concord had into theirs. Dr. Reyes had done most of that, not through threats, but through a negotiating style Thrall had never encountered in 11,000 years of first contacts, relentless, granular, exhausting patience. She would not sign anything until every clause had been picked apart, translated 3 different ways to check for ambiguity, and stress-tested against every worst-case scenario her delegation could imagine, and Thrall came to understand, with something between admiration and quiet dread, that humans were extraordinarily good at imagining worst-case scenarios. It was, he suspected, a side effect of having survived so many of them. The moment Thrall would later identify, in his own private reports back to the Concord homeworld, as the true turning point, happened not in a negotiation room, but in an ordinary human city, on an ordinary human evening, 3 weeks before the treaty was finally signed. A Kaelith cultural liaison, a young, well-meaning officer named Pel Marisk, sent to observe human civilian life firsthand as a gesture of goodwill, had been walking through a public market when a small, localized power failure knocked out the district's electrical grid. Nothing serious. The kind of minor infrastructure failure that happened, according to human records, several times a week in cities of that size. Pel had frozen. His entire species' experience with civilization collapse involved slow, centuries-long declines, carefully managed and mourned. He didn't know what an unscheduled blackout was supposed to mean, and some old, deep instinct told him it meant something was very wrong. Around him, humans did not freeze. Shopkeepers pulled out battery-powered lights they apparently kept for exactly this purpose. A nearby restaurant switched, without missing a beat, to a backup generator that came online within 90 seconds. 2 strangers helped an elderly woman find her way to a bench using the flashlights on their personal communication devices. Within 11 minutes, the power was restored, and the market simply continued, as though nothing had happened at all. Pel filed a report that night that Thrall would read a dozen times over the following weeks. It contained a single line that the Concord's translation algorithms flagged as culturally significant, and that Thrall eventually understood as the truest thing anyone had told him about this species since the Kaelith ship first entered Earth's system. They're not calm because nothing goes wrong, Pel had written. They're calm because everything always goes wrong, and they've simply gotten used to fixing it faster than it can hurt them. The treaty was signed on a gray, unremarkable morning, in the same Geneva conference facility where negotiations had begun 4 months earlier. It bore almost no resemblance to the document Thrall had arrived with. Where the Concord had once offered protection in exchange for oversight, the final agreement offered partnership in exchange for cooperation, a distinction that Thrall's superiors back on the Kaelith homeworld would spend years quietly, uncomfortably debating, because it wasn't the outcome any of them had planned for, and none of them could entirely explain how it had happened. Dr. Reyes signed last, setting down the stylus with the same unhurried patience she'd shown for 4 months straight. Thrall signed after her, and found himself, against every instinct 3 centuries of diplomatic training had built into him, saying something that wasn't in any briefing document. We came here expecting to add a manageable species to the Concord, he said. One more entry in a very long list. And now Reyes asked. Now I'm filing a report recommending that no Concord vessel ever again assume it understands your species until it has watched you fix something that's already broken. That's where you're honest. Not in negotiations. In the recovery. Reyes almost smiled at that. You noticed. I noticed everything, Thrall said. That was the mistake. I thought watching would be enough to understand you. It wasn't. You're not dangerous because of your weapons, or your industry, or even your stubbornness at that negotiating table, though all of that mattered more than my reports accounted for. You're dangerous because you don't panic when things collapse. You built an entire civilization around the assumption that everything eventually breaks, and you've gotten terrifyingly good at not caring, and just building it back. He paused, choosing his next words with the same care he'd have used for a formal Concord address. The Concord has never had to plan for a species like that before. I don't think we know how. 6 months after the treaty was signed, the Kaelith homeworld quietly reclassified humanity's threat designation for the third time, moving them from primitive, cooperative to a new category that had, until that point, been reserved for exactly one other civilization in 11,000 years of Concord history: unpredictable, do not provoke. Ambassador Thrall Bash, for his part, remained on Earth for another 2 years as the Concord's senior liaison, and in his final report before rotating back to the homeworld, he wrote a single closing line that would later be quoted, misquoted, and argued over by Concord scholars for the next century. "We came looking for a species we could add to our list," he wrote. "We found one that will, eventually, decide whether we stay on theirs." He didn't mean it as a threat. By the time he left Earth, he understood humans well enough to know they hadn't wanted a threat either. What they'd wanted, from the very first 6 days of Robert Callahan's uninvited flyby to the last signature on a 4-month negotiation, was simply to be understood correctly, on their own terms, by a civilization old enough to know better than to underestimate them twice. The Concord never made that mistake again, whether that was because they'd learned to respect humanity, or because, somewhere in the back of 11,000 years of careful, orderly first contacts, they'd finally met a species that scared them just enough to be careful, depends entirely on who inside the Concord you ask. Humanity, for its part, never much cared which explanation was true. They'd survived worse questions than that before, and gotten used to fixing what mattered, and letting the rest sort itself out. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you think humanity's greatest advantage really is, and if you want more stories where humanity turns out to be the last species anyone expected to underestimate, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this universe left to explore.